On a Thursday night, about a week after Midsummer Day in the year 1589, an elderly woman died in London. Her name was Anne Willett, known mostly as the Widow Willett, or sometimes as Mother Willett, and she died in her small house in a place called Ship Alley, near Cripplegate, in the northwest corner of the old walled city of London. Her death occasioned a good deal of controversy. After almost a week's illness, she had collapsed catastrophically and she didn't leave a written will. The executorship and the administration of her goods was claimed by one Matthew Pearson, a distant kinsman who was originally from Cumbria. And he claimed these goods in the right of his daughter Anne, who some said, he certainly said, was Widow Willett's intended heir. But when he sought to have the will proved in the church courts, he was challenged by one William White, the nephew of the deceased, on whose behalf it was claimed that Widow Willett had declared on the Sunday before her death that he was to have her goods. And as a result, a case was heard before the Consistory Court of the Bishop of London, meeting in Old St. Paul's Cathedral, and quite a substantial set of depositions survives amongst the records of the court, in which 13 different witnesses testified as to the circumstances of Widow Willett's final days and their understanding of her meaning regarding the disposition of her estate. Now, all of these witnesses were drawn from that large group that contemporaries referred to with some condescension as the common people, or the middle and poorer sort of people sometimes. What did that mean? Well, most simply it meant that they were not of gentle birth. They belonged to the 98% of the population who had no claim to gentility, either by birth or by achievement in the course of their lives. They were not members, in short, of the national ruling class. But that fundamental distinction apart, they were far from being an undifferentiated, homogeneous mass. They vary considerably in wealth and in standing within their own communities. The Elizabethan civil servant and humanist scholar, Sir Thomas Smith, in his book De Republica Anglorum, which was written in the 1560s, distinguished what he called three sorts of people below the rank of gentility. Namely, there were the citizens and burgesses of the towns, there were the yeoman farmers of the countryside, and both of those groups, he said, had their part to play at a low level in the governance of the Commonwealth. But finally, there was what he called the fourth sort of men, which included day labourers, poor husbandmen, small family farmers, and a host of artisans who had in common the fact that, as he put it, they have no voice nor authority in our Commonwealth, and no account is made of them, but only to be ruled, and not to rule others. That was the view from above. But even the labouring poor had some self-esteem. To be sure, when they were required to state their personal worth, all their debts paid, when they acted as witnesses in court, and this would happen from time to time, they could be very tellingly defensive or creatively evasive about confessing their relative poverty. Worth no great matter was a common response. Just lean bacon, said one rural husbandman. A couple of pence if every bird had his feather, said a London craftsman in 1589, the same year as the case we started with. But they were very keen to stress that they didn't depend on charity, that they were industrious. As one Eliza Brown put it, she was worth little thing, but that she earns at her finger's end. And though poor, they usually claimed to be honest. So to return to our witnesses, they included a clothworker's wife, a shoemaker, a coppersmith, another coppersmith's wife who kept a shop, a seaman, a leather seller's wife, a victualler and his wife, 2 servants, and 3 widows who were simply described as honest poor neighbours, such as labour by their hands for their living. One might say this was a pretty typical alley full of people in London at this time. But one of them was a bit unusual. He was a man named William Gorrell, and he was a sailor. He was 32 years old, and he was originally from Yorkshire, though now he usually sailed from King's Lynn and occasionally from London. He lodged with one of the parties to the case, Matthew Pearson, so often, he tells us, as he continued about London and was not at sea, sometimes for as long as 2 or 3 months at a time. He was quite a jolly sailor. He describes in his deposition how he often conversed with the widow Willett when she came to Matthew Pearson's house for Sunday dinner, and the whole company would, as he put it, sit and be merry most part of the Sunday. And he liked pulling the old lady's leg. He tells us always when he met or saw her, he asked her what she meant she did not marry again and take a husband which would make much of her in her old days, which provoked the prim response from widow Willett that she was not minded to marry again. He said he'd last done this about Shrovetide last in February 1589, and to quote him, at such time as he went on the last voyage with Sir Francis Drake. Now, on the assumption that this unasked for snippet of information was actually true, this suggests that William Gorrell, like the young Earl of Essex, had sailed with the ill-fated Drake expedition which attacked Corunna, Lisbon and the Azores in the spring of 1589. Moreover, he'd come back, which many of the expedition didn't. One might even fantasize that if he was a regular member of Francis Drake's crew, he might have served on the Revenge against the Spanish Armada the year before he gave his deposition. He might have helped singe the beard of the King of Spain at Cadiz in 1587. Or even, stretching it a bit, that as a 20-year-old he might have circumnavigated the globe and been to California. That's very unlikely, perhaps, but it's not impossible. Other men like him had certainly done just that. So let me make 2 simple points to start with. These were people of no great account. They're instances of what the great microhistorian Carlo Ginzburg calls history's multitude of forgotten lives, doomed to complete irrelevance. But firstly, they were there too, witnesses to the events of the age, as much as they were to widow Willett's sad decline and death. Some of them may have been amongst the crowd that cheered Elizabeth I's coronation procession in 1559. Some of them may have been amongst the crowds that witnessed the executions of major players in Elizabethan politics on Tower Hill. One of them certainly claimed to have shinned up the rigging of Drake's ship. They were also present and hearing, or then and there present, in the phrase that the courts used to describe witnesses. And secondly, they also had their own stories to tell, and sometimes their stories got recorded. I've told you just a little bit of one of them. These were not the great stories of history with a capital H. They didn't concern structurally transformative events for the most part. They were more often just the small change of what one historian has called underrepresented lives. But if such lives remain underrepresented historiographically, one can also say that they were representative culturally. They left records too. Increasingly they did from the 16th century. And if those records rarely tell us much about events of great note, what happened in history in the conventional sense, they can tell us an awful lot about what was going on. What I want to do then is just to consider those lives, to look at the first Elizabethan age from below and from the middle, to take stock of what we've learned about how such people experienced it over the last 30 years or so, how its developments shaped their lives, and to ask how those experiences and attitudes and aspirations which they had also helped to shape the age within the constraints of the time, within the constraints of their social place. So first, let's just look quickly at some of the basic characteristics of the life experiences of Elizabethans of the middle and poorer sort, the common people. The basic unit of society, of course, for all of them was the household. Amongst the poorer people, households tended to be very small in size and simple in structure, much like the modern family. It sounds very modern when historians describe their household structure. But there were also important differences. Structurally, a large minority of households in the period, those of the relatively prosperous middling people, contained members who were affiliated to the household not by birth or blood, but by contract. They contained servants, they contained apprentices. Sometimes in towns they contained a good number of lodgers. Widow Anne Willett's nephew, William, for example, was a poor apprentice who lived with his master near the landmark London Stone. It's mentioned in one of the depositions. The same London Stone which you can still see in the wall opposite Canongate Station. Matthew Pearson ran a lodging house. He had as many as 3 seamen staying with him at any one time, and as a result he employed servants. One of them was a sailor's wife to work for him and run his small establishment. Most often these additional members of a household were there obviously for a purpose, to work. Functionally, the Elizabethan household was not only a unit of residence and consumption and procreation and child rearing, but also a unit of production, be it a farm in the countryside or a workshop or a commercial enterprise. And for servants and apprentices, it was also a place of education where they learned their craft skills or their domestic skills. And finally, Elizabethan households were also different conceptually, as Naomi Tadmore has taught us. All members were regarded as members of the householder's family. They were included within the sense of family, and the authority of the household head extended over all of them. Writers of domestic conduct books were very keen to stress that the household and family was a sphere of interdependence in which each member had a place and a role, but they also stressed that place and role were hierarchically structured. They repeatedly rehearsed a set of dyadic relationships of authority and subordination: husband, wife, parents, children, masters and mistresses, servants and apprentices. Of course, this highly structured situation in reality was subject to the peculiarities of individual personality, and the evidence brings that out vividly. There were plenty of assertive wives, despite their theoretical subordination. There were plenty of negligent husbands, despite their theoretical authority. There were plenty of disorderly apprentices and stroppy servants. But there was little room for doubt about where authority ultimately lay. Catherine Pearson, Matthew's wife, said that she went to attend Widow Willett in her last sickness because her husband sent her thither. She was accompanied by Elizabeth Wells, her servant, sent at her master's appointment, who later appeared in court at my master's commandment, adding, "She is to obey her master, and therefore look not for money for her travail in this matter." Matthew Pearson himself said that his involvement in the case was in behalf of his child, as he is bound by nature and law to do. They were all of them conforming to their domestic roles, stereotyped domestic roles, in the manner that the court would have expected and doubtless would have approved. The presence of servants and apprentices in these households, in some households, a large minority, also serves as a reminder that this was a surprisingly mobile society geographically, something established by historical demographers long ago and elaborated by many others since. Every community had its core of relatively stable families. One person has described them as dynastic families within their particular communities. Usually those people who were rooted locally by the possession of landed property. Such people were likely to turn out whenever the customs of any town or village were in question, and they could provide the benefit of intergenerational knowledge about how things were done in this particular place. William Tailor, a yeoman farmer, reported in 1616, I'll just slide outside the Elizabethan period briefly, he reported in 1616 how 50 years before, in 1566, when he was 8 years old, he and other boys from Amble in Northumberland had been taken by an elder of the parish and shown the boundary stones between the Queen's land and the Earl of Northumberland's land. And the elder did knock his staff upon the said stones and willed them to remember them. John Clark was shown the same boundary stones 10 years earlier by his grandmother Indeed, one of them of particular importance, she sat him down upon with his bare buttock, he tells us, and willed him to remember it so long as he should live. He was only 8 years old when she did that. He was 68 when he gave evidence as to where the boundary stone was. So clearly this was a very effective educational method. I mean, you could say it had impact. So there was intergenerational stability for some, and the development of personal and communal identities rooted, deeply rooted, in a particular place. But many young people, and probably most, left home in their mid-teens to be apprenticed in a nearby town, perhaps, or to move around a rural area on annual contracts as farm servants, until eventually they would settle down sometime in their mid to late 20s and marry and become settled members of a particular community. And some moved still longer distances to major cities, some of them in search of betterment, some of them just looking for any kind of a living. Of the witnesses in the Anne Willett case, 9 of them told the court their place of birth and where they had lived subsequently. Only 3 of the 9 had been born in London, and none of them were currently residing in the metropolitan parish where they'd been born. They'd moved around the city. The others came from 6 different English counties, from Cumberland in the north, and Devon in the far west, to Staffordshire and Northamptonshire in the Midlands, and Kent in the southeast. As I've already said, Matthew Pearson was originally from Cumberland, as was his sister, who had joined him. Most of them had been in London by the age of 30 at the latest, many of them much earlier, to judge by the ages which they gave. So Ship Alley must have been quite a babel of different regional dialects. Settlement in a particular place, be it town or country, often went along with marriage. Elizabeth Wells, one of our witnesses, who was aged 30 in 1589, told the court how she'd worked as a servant after coming to London for several years in Stepney, at the eastern extremity of the city, and then she'd worked for a year at St. Clement's, at the western extremity of the city, and then she'd met and married a sailor in the autumn of 1588 and moved east again to live in the Docklands. And marriage and settlement was also conventionally the point of a transition to adult life. It was deemed to be appropriate only at the point at which a new couple were capable of maintaining themselves independently. The chance of achieving and sustaining independence was perhaps highest in the many cases in which a match had been carefully considered, was the outcome of what's been described as the multilateral consent of all interested parties, the young people, their parents, some of their closer relatives, people who could give their goodwill, as it was often described, to them, friends who would contribute towards the marriage portion which would help to set them up. Amongst the poor, who were more likely to have to make their own decisions in these matters once they were sure of a partner, as they put it, and thought they could manage in future, with the help of whatever domestic goods they'd been able to accumulate and the wages they hoped to earn. For them, it could be a much trickier proposition. And the woman I've mentioned, Elizabeth Wells, is a case in point. She'd married her sailor, Henry Corbett, in 1588, but she was still a servant. Presumably, a servant in another person's household as a means of maintaining herself while her husband was at sea. And interestingly, she still used and was known to other people who mentioned her by her maiden name. In fact, the evidence is that marriages amongst the labouring poor could be sometimes subject to a great deal of insecurity. Divorce was not available to people legally, but informal separations in the early years of marriages seem to have been not uncommon, sometimes indeed taking the form of simple desertion when a couple found it hard to make ends meet. And amongst rich and poor alike, marriage was also subject to the further insecurity of the early death of a spouse, from the infectious diseases for which there was no cure known, or in childbed. Those who were widowed in this way often remarried rapidly if they could. Generally, the historical demographers tell us within 6 months to a year. And in a sense, they needed to do so if they could, because usually by that time there were children to be raised and maintained. The evidence of parish register analysis is that most women had their first child within 18 months of marriage. A very high proportion of them in some areas were actually several months pregnant at marriage, which people work out by taking the date of their marriage and then checking through the parish register till you find the birth of the first child. It's not unusual for 25, 30, 35% of brides to be pregnant, often in the early stages of pregnancy, may not even have realized when they married. Thereafter, a married woman on average would bear a child every 2 to 3 years, which means in effect that they could expect to be pregnant for a quarter to a third of their entire adult lives until menopause, if they lived that long. Many of those children, of course, died young, in infancy or childhood, but most lived into their teens. And by then, it was not unusual for them to be living with a step-parent, or sometimes, especially in the towns, even with parents, neither of whom was actually their biological parent, but who had inherited the children from earlier successions of spouses through series of remarriage. So in a sense, Elizabethans were perfectly familiar with what is now referred to as the phenomenon of the blended family. Though amongst them, it was the outcome not of divorce and remarriage, but of high mortality and remarriage. So households and families provided the immediate context of everyday life. But they didn't do so in isolation. Rather, they pursued their affairs in the context of networks of mutuality and reciprocal obligation formed with other households. These could be of many kinds, but undoubtedly the most important were those of kinship and of neighbourhood. Kinship ties amongst the common people in this period have been described as relatively flexible, relatively permissive. Genealogically, a person might have many living kinsmen, but geographical mobility meant that kin might not be locally available in large numbers. Nevertheless, within the dispersed universe of the extended family, if known kinsmen were not always recognized in that way, such recognition was always possible. It was an option. Kinsmen could be thought of as a kind of resource that could be, and often was, activated and drawn upon, a potential source of obligation that could be appealed to in order to mobilize support when required. And there's much evidence that it was so mobilized frequently. Anne Willett's case illustrates this. She seems not to have known her nephew William White very well, still less his mother, Anne Freethorn, a widow of Anne's long-dead brother, who had remarried long ago and hadn't seen the old woman for many months. On the other hand, her kinsman Matthew Pearson had her to dinner every Sunday and arranged for her care during her final illness. She allegedly declared before her death that she was greatly beholding unto Matthew Pearson and his wife, that she knew not whither to go that she might be so well welcome as she was there, and that their daughter Anne was her kinswoman and her right hand, and one she loved well. It's true that Matthew Pearson's solicitude for the old woman was probably not unrelated to the fact that Anne Willett was constantly dangling the prospect that his daughter would inherit her goods. What to do with her goods after her death, in fact, seems to have been her principal topic of conversation, to judge by what various witnesses said. But Matthew Pearson may indeed have had a strong sense of kinship obligation. It's interesting that he'd housed and employed his sister Cicely for 3 years when she first came to London from Cumberland, and until such time as she got herself established and found herself work elsewhere. Neighbours, in contrast, were a continuous presence by virtue of their geographical propinquity. The neighbourhood was a rather loosely defined place, a body of people, a community with shared knowledge of one another, a source of myriad forms of minor practical help and emotional support within limits, and also, in other ways, a sphere of surveillance, of constraint, of judgment of other people's behaviour, and of reproof. It's well known that good neighbourliness was considered a critically important moral virtue in this period and is frequently appealed to in the records of the time. Living quietly, as they put it, living quietly with your neighbours was a critically important social practice. And the depositions in the Willett case, in fact, tell us more about neighbourliness than anything else. Anne Willett's neighbours had mostly known her for 10 to 18 years. The court asked them, how long have you known the people involved in this case? 10 to 18 years for the most part. Several of them described how they did go to fetch her home when she was initially taken ill, when she was away from the street. Several of the older women described how they sat with her upon a low stall, hard without the alley gate, 2 days later, and took occasion to talk to her about her state of health. They gave her very firm and unsolicited advice about what she should do, since her death might be imminent. They told her she should name her heirs and send for them. They told her she should inventory her goods. They told her she should go in and not sit here, lest you be taken suddenly and die in the street. They told her to set such things as she had in readiness and good order, and die not like a beggar. 2 of them set off on their own initiative to alert her nephew, William White, whom she'd mentioned to them. They were also able to describe her movements over the next few days, to quote the documents, from one neighbour's house to another within the court. They knew who had visited her. One of them added that she dwelled in such sort that none could knock or come to her house, but this examinant must needs see them. They heard her call piteously for drink on the night before her death. Some of them got up to go to see how she was, found her in a state of collapse, offered words of religious comfort to her, and finally her next-door neighbour called up when she died, helped lay her out by the walls, we're told. So all of that sketches the web or constellation of relationships within which people lived, and some of the characteristic phases of the life course. And much of what I've described would have been equally true, I'm sure, of the 15th century or of the later 17th and 18th centuries. And yet, these perennial experiences and aspects of the life course were also lived out and pursued under changing conditions. And it's the larger dynamic of historical change that gives a distinctive texture and flavour to any particular part of the early modern period, and perhaps the Elizabethan age in particular. Our witnesses can provide a point of entry to that larger dynamic. Those of them who gave their age to the court were aged between 23 and 80 years old. All of them would have known something about the dynastic insecurities of the Tudor dynasty and the consequences that it had for the history of the 16th century. The oldest of them, Alice Ward, had been 24 already when Henry VIII put aside Catherine of Aragon and married Anne Boleyn. She probably heard the bells ringing for the birth of the Princess Elizabeth in 1533, and she'd seen 6 queens come and go before she was 40. 3 of them had been young adults under the boy King Edward VI and his regents, 5 under Lady Jane Grey and Mary I, Bloody Mary. 7 of them were over 16 when Elizabeth took the throne in 1559, and only 4 of them had known no other monarch. All of them, no doubt, would have heard something about the Queen's courtships, the rumours about her possible marriages, and wondered perhaps about the succession problem and what would come next. No one was under 21 when the most obvious candidate for the succession, Mary Queen of Scots, lost her head at Fotheringay Castle in 1587. They can't have been unaware of all of this. They can't have been unaware either of another tortuous set of changes, those associated with the English Reformation. Alice Ward was 25 at the time of the royal supremacy over the English Church. She'd witnessed the dissolution of the monasteries and its enormous impact upon the townscape of London and other places. She'd witnessed the putting down of the cult of the saints, the heartbeat of medieval popular religion, and the issue of the Great Bible in English, all before she was 30. 5 of our witnesses were old enough to have registered the term towards radical Protestantism under King Edward VI and his protectors. 7 of them may have welcomed or feared the restoration of Catholicism under Mary I. Those who were already present in Ship Alley could easily have smelled the burnings of the Protestant martyrs at Smithfield under Mary. Ship Alley was just a little to the east of Smithfield. The same 7 people would have seen the turn back to Protestantism with the Elizabethan settlement. Some of them, as I've said, might have seen the Queen's coronation procession. They would have witnessed her perhaps ostentatiously embracing the English Bible as she passed through the crowds of London. Only 4 of them had been raised from childhood in the Elizabethan Church of England, and one suspects that these people would have had a very fluid sense of religious identity. They would have experienced broader changes too. When Alice Ward had been 16 in 1525, the estimated population of England was about 2.4 million. By 1589, when she gave her deposition, it was over 3.8 million and still growing quite rapidly, growing in fact at a faster rate than it was to achieve again before the Industrial Revolution of the late 18th century. Over roughly the same period, the price of bread in London more than doubled, and those of meat, poultry and dairy produce trebled, while wages remained sluggish for decades. So for many of the common people, these were hard times. It was just as well that the price of beer rose less, because the common people, we've recently been told, derived a great deal of their calorific intake from beer and drank so much of it, as much as a gallon a day for labouring men, as to lead one recent historian of nutrition to speculate about, to quote him, the whereabouts of the cut-off line between drunkenness and normal intoxication. It was also a time of commercial quickening and economic expansion, a phenomenon reflected in, for example, the marked increase in litigation in the courts at Westminster, occasioned by commercial debt claims. Christopher Brooks has found that there were 5,300 such cases brought before the Central Common Law Courts at Westminster in 1560. In 1580, over 13,000, and the number of cases was still rising. Such disputes over commercial dealings which had gone wrong were just the tip of the iceberg of an expanding internal trade in Elizabethan England. It was a period also of urbanisation. If some formerly significant cities continued the stagnation which had been part of their late medieval experience, many small towns were growing, and so were the major provincial centres. York from 8 to 12,000 inhabitants under Elizabeth, Newcastle from 5 to 10,000. And above all, there was, of course, London. Perhaps 55,000 in the 1520s, perhaps 70,000 in the 1550s, 200,000 by 1600, and still growing, stretching out into new suburbs to the north and to the east. And most of our witnesses, migrants, had been part of that massive metropolitan swarming. All of this had consequences for people's life chances. It involved, as R.H. Tawney put it long ago, but very well, social adjustments to meet the new situation, a regrouping of social forces, new conceptions of social expediency to get by in this changing context, any or all of which adjustments could mean trouble for the relatively powerless. Those of our witnesses who had rural backgrounds may have been well aware of the competition over resources that was taking place in the countryside, the land hunger amongst the young, too many people growing to adulthood with no place for them on the land, the gradual pushing up of rents by landlords who were anxious to keep their estate income ahead of inflation, the encroachments by some landlords upon tenurial customs and common rights, the enclosure of open fields or common land, the way in which many rural communities were gradually polarising as the gulf between the village elites of more substantial farmers on the one hand and the smallholders who were struggling and the landless labourers who were really struggling widened to a greater extent, severing some of the shared interests of those groups. All of our witnesses must have been aware of the growing problems of poverty and vagrancy occasioned by population growth and economic change. It was harder for the labouring poor to make a living. At the prices and wages that were current in Hull, a labourer in the 1530s would have needed to find 214 days' work each year if he was to adequately feed himself and his wife and 2 children. Donald Woodward calculated this. That's a tall order already. By the 1590s, the same kind of person would have needed to find 346 days' work, a practical impossibility. And if there was no work available, the alternative was the road and a possible slide into permanent vagrancy and a precarious and often short life on the streets of some city. Paul Griffiths has recently presented some of those who were taken up on the streets of London and who were described, physically described, in the records of the Bridewell Court, which had been set up in the 1550s with jurisdiction over petty street crime and vagrancy in London to deal with these growing problems. So, for example, amongst the Bridewell records was Ellen Shaw, taken and brought before the court in 1571, described in the records as somewhat gross and of a middle stature, full-faced, black-browed, with 2 broad teeth, somewhat black, which protruded. She was dressed in a red petticoat with a white upper bodice and an old coloured cassock, which was ragged. And there were hundreds of others so described in the records of the Bridewell, some of them described as slender, some as thick-set, one man as great gutty. Some had flaxen hair, some were dark brown, some black. Some were known regionally by their accents, a northern man by his tongue, one is described. Many were sore diseased, the court said. Many had scald heads, a kind of scalp disease. Some were crazed, crack-brained, simple. And the measures taken by the government to contain or repress these growing problems must also have impinged upon the lives of all of our witnesses. The Statute of Artificers of 1563, which attempted to stabilise relationships between masters, servants and employees, the longest statute passed by any English parliament before the 19th century. That affected their lives. The Poor Laws, initiated in the Elizabethan period and imposing on parishes compulsory rating for the relief of the deserving so-called impotent poor, the deserving poor, while mandating exemplary punishment, whippings for the idle and the vagrant. The broadening and the harshening of the criminal code in this period, which created more offences, achieved better enforcement, and despite the fact that the courts went through theatrical displays of mercy for lesser offenders, actually in the long term reduced traditional forms of mitigation and ensured more punishment. Estimates of the number of people who were publicly executed by hanging in England in the late Elizabethan period vary from 600 to 1,200 a year. And no one has even tried to estimate the numbers who were stocked or pilloried or whipped or branded. Even if we take the lowest estimate of the execution rate at 600 a year, this meant that for a population of about 4 million, around 1,600, there was an annual execution rate per million population, which was actually 150 times higher than that of the state of Texas in the early 21st century, which in the United States is regarded as a national scandal. 150 times higher in Elizabethan England. Among the crimes subject to new legislation was, of course, that of witchcraft. Legislated against in 1563, most likely as a result of the contingency of an alleged plot to use sorcery against the Queen's life. But once it was on the statute book, enabling the sporadic resolution of neighbourhood tensions and anxieties and suspicions of maleficent magic, with the bringing of a court case which might result in the execution of suspected witches. And both the cases and the executions were at their peak between the late 1570s and the 1590s. So, these were turbulent, hard, often harsh times for many of the common people, and from their perspective it's not difficult to paint a pretty bleak picture. R.H. Tawney observed a century ago that, to quote him, "the brilliant age which begins with Elizabeth gleams against a background of social squalor and misery." He went on to juxtapose what he called the calm, proud faces of those who, from the galleries of their great mansions, still stare down on us with the unshakable assurance of men untroubled by regret or perplexity. And he contrasted that with the cost paid for such splendour by their tenants and those over whom they ruled. And there's truth in that, much truth. But it's also true, as Tawney himself recognised, that these processes of change infiltrated people's lives to different degrees, at different times, and with different outcomes. As I've already indicated, the common people were not a homogeneous entity, and over time that differentiation was becoming ever more complex. How different segments of that broad social category, the common people, experienced the Elizabethan age was equally complex. This was very apparent in the economic sphere. In rural England, some manorial communities, notably those who had very secure forms of land tenure, were able to successfully resist the pressures of their landlords to raise their rents or change their customs. They could be tenacious in resisting them and not infrequently successful. They could go to law to oppose unreasonable rental and tenurial demands. They could riot against enclosures to provoke court cases which led to a mediated settlement. And in both cases, they not infrequently met with sympathetic judges. In fact, in the later 16th century, the tide of landlord-led enclosure of the land seems to have been temporarily stemmed, although it was later renewed, though often through agreement between landlords and tenants. At the same time, the more substantial yeoman farmers often chose to go with the flow of change. They had large surpluses to sell, and they were often thoroughly commercial in their attitudes. They could profit from rising prices. They could afford to pay higher rents. They were ready to snap up additional bits of land that came on the local land market and expand their operations. They could see the benefit of tenurial change and enclosures to an enterprising man. Many of them were willing to cooperate. Whatever the case, the late 16th century saw the flourishing of the yeomanry. A recent study shows that the average reported worth, your stated personal financial worth, of yeoman farmers more than doubled between the third and fourth quarters of the 16th century, especially in the south of England, while that of small farming husbandmen and craftsmen remained stable. There's a differentiation taking place. This was also the age of the great rebuilding of yeoman houses, involving the addition of chimneys and staircases and upper chambers, and the acquisition of new levels of comfort in their domestic furnishings, joined furniture, better bedding, pewter vessels, more elaborate cooking equipment. It was also a period of opportunity for social mobility. If village society was to some degree polarizing, those who were best placed to take advantage of the opportunities of the times could not only enhance their own wealth, but they could afford larger dowries to marry their daughters better. They could place their sons in more advantageous urban apprenticeships, which were expensive to get. They could send them to school. In the towns, the quickening of commercial and manufacturing activity produced similar benefits. Some of the common people then were benefiting, sometimes substantially, from the economic changes of the period. They were actively involved in these changes. The ambitions and the aspirations of some of them helped to drive those changes. And similarly, the growth of the Tudor state was not something that they simply endured. For there were those amongst them who, as Sir Thomas Smith put it, are participant in our Commonwealth. The expanding agenda of Elizabethan government involved a typical Tudor combination of central direction and devolution. It was centrally directed, the state called the tune, but it relied for the effectiveness of the greater reach of government into the provinces by the cooperation of local officers right down to the level of the parish, the manor, the small town. To this extent, the growth of the state, as one person has put it, was creating an intensifying dialogue between central government and the localities, right down to a surprisingly low social level. Christopher Brooks has emphasized in his work on English legal history how the so-called charges, which were delivered to juries assembled in local courts, served not only as a medium of legal education, the magistrates delivering the charge to educate the jurors in their duties, but also, as he puts it, it was the most common and perhaps the most important medium for the expression of political discourse in this period. Manorial jurors might be told about the historical and legal significance of their role within the little commonwealth, as it was described, of their rural manor. And in county quarter sessions, juries of yeoman farmers and minor gentlemen learned similar lessons about the commonwealth as a whole. And those lessons were not just a simple matter of obey the crown, though that also featured. Richard Crumpton, a magistrate, in a charge which he delivered at Stafford in 1587, discussed before the jury the nature of law and of justice, with the help of references to Cicero, to Aristotle, and to Marsilius of Padua, the medieval political philosopher. William Lambard delivered charges to juries in Kent in the 1580s, which explained the nature of England's mixed polity. Not an absolute monarchy, but a mixed polity. And in 1591, he urged the jury to do their part, to defend what he described as your native liberty. All of them were engaged in persuading people to maintain their loyalty to the government, but at the same time encouraging them to do so by participating in it, and not just as reliable subalterns. Similarly, this was a period which saw marked growth in England's urban corporate system. Many towns became for the first time boroughs with royal charters, giving them rights of self-government and periodic representation in Parliament. Representation of smaller towns in Parliament grew considerably. It's been described as a process which encouraged a strong sense of participatory citizenship in the pursuit of the public good. These new boroughs were described at the time as civic commonwealths, and so they were. Philip Withington has described what he calls the development of a kind of civic republicanism amongst these self-governing urban communities. And it certainly involved a considerable emphasis upon the notion of civility in urban governance. The mayor of Cambridge, who was a fishmonger by trade, was not the only civic leader who was concerned about establishing the rules of debate in the council of the town. He laid down in a series of regulations that every man should be heard with quietness and without disturbance. And he instituted fines for unseemly or indecent speeches between the members of the council. Many guild ordinances had similar rules for conduct in the discussion of guild business. Guilds of Carlisle is a good example. They forbade thumping the table, no thumping. Indeed, civility, the notion of civility in behaviour and discourse, by 1600 was a concept that many people would have encountered. It was being added to their linguistic repertoire. It was being added to their repertoire of personal conduct in such contexts. It underlay the Articles, which were drawn up in 1599 by the chief inhabitants of the rural parish of Swallowfield in Berkshire, to the end, they wrote, that we may better and the more quietly live together. Article 1 of the rules for business in Swallowfield were, first, it is agreed that every man shall be heard at our meeting quietly, one after another, and that none shall interrupt another in his speech, and that every man shall speak in order, that thereby the depth of each man's judgment with reason may be considered. It's no accident that the Bond of Association of 1584, by which people swore to take vigilante action against the perpetrators in the event of the successful assassination of Queen Elizabeth, the Bond of Association, it was voluntarily subscribed not only by members of the court and the Privy Council and county magistrates, but also by many commoners, right down to the level of parish officers. So too with the Reformation. In recent years, the preoccupation of an earlier generation of historians with the popularity or the unpopularity of the English Reformation, its successes and its failures, that preoccupation has given way to a concern with what Christopher Marsh calls the compliance conundrum. The problem of how, as he puts it, a Reformation initially unexpected, indeed unwanted, gradually and steadily worked its way into popular culture. Now that process was essentially an Elizabethan problem. And in resolving it, attempting to understand the responses of the common people to the Reformation process is absolutely crucial. Of course, they had not been consulted about the Elizabethan settlement of 1559, but they couldn't ignore it. And the conformity of most of them was the principal reason that it became a settlement at all, and that the settlement eventually became a new religious identity. Those shifts involved all of them, though in particular those principal inhabitants of the parishes who served as churchwardens and vestrymen, who saw to the maintenance and the alteration of the fabric and furnishings of their churches, who followed or evaded the injunctions which were sent down to them by the bishops for enforcement, who either observed and presented the religious lapses of their fellow parishioners or chose to turn a blind eye to them. Understanding the Elizabethan Reformation as a process of gradual cultural accommodation requires us to grasp that it involved, as Ethan Shagan puts it, a process of religious change that was not done to the people, but was rather done with them in a dynamic process of engagement between the government's demands and the people's responses. Of course, the government called the tune as usual, but there were many reasons why people might choose to dance to it. The instinctive obedience of people taught from childhood that royal authority was divinely ordained and must be obeyed. The fact that Elizabeth demanded only a minimal conformity to the new regime. She would not make windows into men's souls, as she put it. The continuity of clerical personnel in many of the parishes, a familiar priest, now Anglican clergyman. The continuities in basic beliefs and teachings and services provided within the parish church, matters perhaps of far more importance to most people than the issues of theological controversy which preoccupied the better educated. And also, there were the cultural preferences of people brought up to see neighbourly love and charity as the essence of their religion, and who'd witnessed the bloody turmoil of the mid-16th century. A preference, Christopher Marsh puts it, for holding their peace, and by that he means holding your peace in a double sense. On the one hand, staying quiet about issues which could be dangerous, but secondly, of preserving the peace of their own communities in the face of zealots of whatever persuasion. But more positively, as both memory and material evidence of the old faith gradually faded in the late 16th century, there was the gradual elaboration of what's been called a post-Reformation, if not strictly Protestant, religious culture, a good deal of which was transmitted to people orally through the repeated reading aloud of central texts to congregations of neighbours. The English Bible, successive versions of which remain based on the translations of William Tyndale, whose initial rendering of the New Testament had claimed to present the Testament as it was written and caused to be written by them which heard it. But what the people now heard had also been Englished, not least by Tyndall and those who completed his work. As Naomi puts it, it was rendered to them in terms that made sense to people at the time, even if they involved subtle shifts in meaning from the Hebrew and Greek original. Some of the examples she's recently provided. How various distinguishable relationships of amity and friendship became just neighbours in the English Bible. How slaves could become servants, how concubines could become wives, how, my favourite example from your book, how no fewer than 5 different biblical birds became owls. No wonder it spoke to them. The Book of Common Prayer, also providing a framework of words and actions to address a wide range of most fundamental human needs. Its retention of many elements of tradition, loathed by Puritans, of course, but matters which aided its reception. But it was an agent of change, as well as an agent of continuity. It was absorbed by repetition and habit, and became a tool for the creation of a new religious culture. There are echoes of it all over. As Eamon Duffy puts it beautifully, Cranmer's somberly magnificent prose, read week by week, entered and possessed their minds. It became the fabric of their prayers, the utterance of their most solemn and vulnerable moments. Metrical psalms, sung to familiar tunes. They weren't required by the Church of England, but were widely adopted by the 1570s and usually sung before and after sermons, a powerful public experience ingraining biblical poetry in the minds of the congregation. And so on could go on. There were sermons, of course, beloved by many, endured by most, and the soundscape of the parish church was further enlivened by those who groaned aloud in prayer or cried out, Amen. John Craig, trying to recreate that soundscape, has concluded that Elizabethan services were a lot noisier, or at least more interactive than we often imagine. They were less a scene of hushed awe than what he calls a participatory, audible, and emotional response. And in such ways, people gradually became parish Anglicans. As Norman Jones observes, perhaps they were not good Protestants, but they knew they were not Catholics, and they related together in ways that used the Protestant language. For the godlier amongst them, that vernacular religious culture also involved the Geneva Bible, their Bible of preference, with its numbered verses and its notes. It was a study Bible. They also had an emergent world of cheap religious print. They repeated sermons amongst themselves, generally led by someone who had the capacity to take notes on the sermon. All of that required, of course, the ability to read and write. And this links us to a final major shift in the experience of the common people. The fact that the Elizabethan age was also the threshold period in the growth of popular literacy in England. People were encouraged to have their children taught to read for religious purposes, and they also learned from experience that in an increasingly commercial world, it was highly desirable that some at least of them be taught to read and write for far more practical and instrumental purposes. But whatever their motivation, and it could include both of these things, of course, it was a period notable for both the founding of endowed grammar schools and writing schools in the towns, and the proliferation of impermanent but numerous petty schools in town and country alike, teaching basic literacy. Attending school cost time, it cost money, and inevitably opportunity to attend was socially restricted, and also restricted by gender. Girls perhaps being taught to read if they were lucky, but only usually in families of some substance. Nevertheless, the impact upon the middle sort of people was considerable for all its limitations. Illiteracy, usually measured by people's inability to sign their names, because writing was taught to people only after they'd achieved already a competent level of reading, so we can use whether they can sign or not as a kind of substitute measure for literacy. This is a very imperfect method, but one that nonetheless tells a significant story. In Norfolk and Suffolk, 55% of yeoman farmers were unable to sign their name in the 1580s, only 39% by the 1600s, early 1600s. 60% of tradespeople were unable to sign in the 1580s. That was down to 48% by the 1600s, and the slow improvement continued. And in the cities, the evidence is that levels of achievement were much higher and more likely to include women and even servants and labouring people who in an urban context might learn to read. By the end of Elizabeth's reign, then, far more of the common people could read and write than had previously been the case. What they read, if they had the ability to do so, is an open question, but certainly the Bible, the prayer book, a great deal of ephemeral ballad and chapbook literature, probably. Some may also have read their grammar school textbooks. Many of them, no doubt, used their skills only very occasionally, but at least one could suggest that they had greater familiarity with formal language and expression. Just after 1600, the man who recorded the settlement of a dispute between the lord of the manor of Stepney and Hackney and his tenants put down in the manorial records, "The clouds of difference are now overblown. Everlastingly may be bright sunshine upon these manors, that their customs may be as famous and as sought after to be precedents to others, as were the laws of Solon, which the Senate of Rome sent deputies to fetch very near 400 years after the same had been established at Athens, thereby to frame their 12 tables." Now, this is astonishingly pompous rubbish. But the point is, it is classically educated, pompous rubbish. This man has been to grammar school. And we've got good evidence for the fact that some of those like him who'd attended their town grammar schools became conspicuously literate amongst the writers of the English Renaissance. William Shakespeare, son of a small-town glover, Edmund Spenser, probably a journeyman's son, Ben Jonson, stepson of a bricklayer, Sir Thomas Smith, great civil servant of the period who rose from being the son of an Essex yeoman farmer, sent to grammar school, spotted as a talented boy, sent to Cambridge. All these and others had the good fortune to attend a grammar school and, in some cases, a university. Most of them aspired to achieving gentility, and sometimes they did so, but they came from the common people. Nor did most of them write solely for the elite, for the market for their published works was broader, and even the unlettered could see and hear their plays, not only in London, but elsewhere. So to end, we can return to Tawney's dictum. The Elizabethan age gleamed not so much against a background of social squalor, though there was plenty of that, but against a hive of activity amongst otherwise obscure people. The common people were very much present. Their role traditionally was to work and not to grudge or murmur against their lot, and they certainly worked, probably a good deal harder under the conditions of the time. But they also observed, they heard, they murmured, they spoke. If their lives were repeatedly impacted by events in which they had no say and caught up in social processes over which they had little control, it's also true that they had a hand in shaping the great processes of the age and in the outcome of those events. Historical change moves at different speeds, at different times, and for different people. In the first Elizabethan age, one could say that the times were very much on the move. And there's a good case to be put up for regarding the generation that came of age in the 1580s and remained active till the 1610s and 20s as being a kind of watershed generation in the transition of the early modern era in England. It was the generation when the currents of economic and social structural change became irreversible, the generation when a new religious identity crystallized, the generation when involvement in governance created a new kind of political culture amongst people below the level of the gentry, when the literacy threshold was decisively crossed, when a new sense of national identity and cultural self-confidence was becoming palpable. All of this meant coming to terms with the fact that some old worlds had been broken that others were fraying, but it also involved the creation of new worlds which brought not only new hardships but new possibilities. We're most familiar with the names of the movers and shakers of the times, the faces on the coins, the faces that still, as Tony said, stare down from their gallery walls, the great actors of top-down history. But the inhabitants of places like Ship Alley and their associates were also living through a watershed period. How much they apprehended that is a matter for speculation. We only know what they said about Anne Willett's death, because that was the only utterance of theirs that was ever written down. But I've suggested that they were also present, also hearing, at much more than that, and hinted at some of the memories that some of them must have had. They were present and doing, too, making their own history, albeit under circumstances not of their own choosing. George Putnam described the poets of the Elizabethan age as makers. So were the common people whose language the poets were transforming. Not just part of the story, but in terms of lived experience of the age, most of the story.